We often use this tagline of with life at the center. But what does agriculture with life look like? What does healthcare, what does education with life look like? What does society, communities, municipalities, government with life look like? And I think we have designed life out of it all unintentionally. I don't think anybody would say, well, we don't want life in our systems. But our designs are designed to be machines with specific outcomes. And those specific outcomes are not at all the conditions that create more life. They usually shut life down. And I feel like really at the heart of nRhythm is to break down those silos, to bring people into a conversation and recognize that at the heart of all of that is this with life approach that brings more, not less.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real. I'm Neal Collins, and in this episode I'm joined by Tre Cates, a seasoned entrepreneur turned regenerative strategist who founded the firm nRhythm. As the world moves into a new era, we are required to rethink and redesign our homes, businesses, cities, and institutions. And unfortunately, there isn't really a playbook on how to do this. Under the banner of sustainability, work is being done to reduce emissions, create more circular supply chains, and monitor and evaluate impact metrics. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the majority of real estate companies and even large publicly traded companies on the S&P 500 mention sustainability as a component of their work. While these endeavors have certainly come a long way over the past couple decades, we know that the sustainability frameworks don't always create the intended outcome of a thriving and alive world. As thought leaders have been calling on us to deepen our frameworks and embrace regeneration, it's not so clear on how to do that, much less do it in a way that creates meaningful livelihood and profitability. That's why I wanted to have Tre join me for a conversation. You see, Tre is a seasoned entrepreneur with an interesting background where he first started off within theology and then got into technology companies as a serial entrepreneur. Throughout these experiences, Tre began to see the shortcomings of business as usual and began to develop his own working knowledge of regenerative frameworks that he has been teaching to business leaders from across the globe. Tre will be the first to admit that he's not a real estate expert, but he does offer a potent question that I believe transcends all industries. And that's, what does this look like if life were at the center? If you're interested to get involved with Tre's regenerative business trainings, he has teamed up with John Fullerton at the Capital Institute with a new program they are calling With Life that you can check out through nRhythm's website. And without further ado, let's get into it with Tre Cates. Tre, it's a pleasure to have you onto the podcast. This has actually been a long time coming. I don't know if it was one of those, like, I'm nervous to have this conversation. And why I say that is just because I see you as a real figurehead within the regenerative movement. And so before we get into life's work and all that, something really jumped out at me that I just thought would be a great way to kick this off. I usually talk about, upbringing and background, but you've got this theology background that moved into computers, that moved into regeneration, and I need to understand the thread there.
Sure. Yeah, it's a long, windy road that led to ultimately this kind of life-centered approach and focus. And actually, through it all was a desire for life to be more meaningful. I mean, I would say theology and philosophy was deeply rooted in how do we live a meaningful life. And technology, I said, well, for us to live a meaningful life, it's got to be meaningful, 24 hours of the day. So what does that look like? Well, that means the workplace has got to be meaningful. So let's start businesses that bring meaning to the workplace. And then regeneration came from a lens of seeing it through an ecosystem view. And that was the work I began with the Savory Institute in 2009. And that really gave me a lens and language that was early in the process of me seeing it through this living systems perspective. And so that, to me, the through line in all of it was life in theology and what does it mean to transform what is your life, and organizations, what it look like to live and work in community with one another, to large systems. What does it look like to reimagine them all with this lens of life at the center? And I just had never been particularly interested in just staying in a particular box or industry. So this transitioned through multiple different iterations and forms. And that has served me and the work I'm doing in the world incredibly well.
Yeah, I actually want to pull it apart a little bit more, because for me, a lot of the work that I do has been centered upon the philosophy of regenerative agriculture, and realizing that creating the conditions for life to flourish isn't just a soil issue, but it's a habitat issue, and we are part of that habitat. But that's where I want to hone in, is like, the Savory Institute is one of those organizations that's become this global thing, probably not whenever you joined. So what was that like to go from, it looked like you're doing more of the computer technology side of entrepreneurship, and then into agriculture?
Yeah. So it was very serendipitous. And friends of mine were living on the western slope of Colorado, and were friends with a couple of the board members of the Savory Institute. And they were just starting and in this kind of phase of trying to reimagine what would be a global approach to land regeneration. And we didn't even use the word regeneration back then. That was really restoration would have been used, or desertification, which is like, so how do we reverse what was a desertifying or a degradation of the current landscapes? And I was just completely intrigued. I hadn't even thought about any of those things beforehand. And I thought about it from a community standpoint, from an individual standpoint, from a team standpoint. But to see a large system degraded, I just didn't have the eyes to see that. And when I was introduced, it literally was transformational for me. And because of my background in business, my background in building organizations, it was very clear that I had something I could bring around that. And they had a cause that was deeply rooted in years and years of work. Alan Savory's holistic management, a philosophy of how we approach management, really was the impetus for what is nRhythm today, was that kind of approach. And I just dove in, had no background, to your point, no background in ag, no background in environmental activism or climate work. All of that was new, but I had new eyes, and I recognized very quickly its application to social contexts, not just what we would have considered natural or biological contexts, and or ecological. And so I just became a huge student and really began to realize there was some patterns and potentially emerging frameworks that could give meaning to all this in ways that I think would really transform the work we do in the world. And I just happened to be at the right time where regeneration wasn't even a word we used. It was something that emerged as a part of all this work we were doing, and got to be a part of seeing that come to fruition. And now it's a buzzword. I remember none of us would have ever used in the early days.
Do you think that that perspective is catching on within regenerative agriculture. I mean, just this past year, I was in Colorado at a regenerative agriculture conference, and it was interesting as we come at it from more blending together, harmonizing the natural and the human habitat. And you would have thought I'd be speaking a completely foreign language, or not even from this planet. That it seemed like the prevailing thought was regeneration is about no-till or moving animals quickly over a piece of ground. And so it's interesting that you picked up on these other patterns, or these patterns that are more widely applicable. Where do you see that conversation going within agriculture?
Well, I think what you just said is the current limitation. And I actually had a talk I did not too long ago for Force of Nature, and then one with Heifer International, where the essence of the talk was for us to move beyond agriculture. And because we know it's education that influences how we will design agriculture, we know it's policy that will influence how we design agriculture. It's how we do economies that influences how we produce food and fiber as a part of this. And to, in essence, reduce regeneration to a product or a service or a practice would be to, in essence, extract the very soul. It is a living system. And so all of that is living needs a very different management approach. And that's really the lesson that Alan brought. That's the one that we have picked up as a mantle and really want to lean into. It is we need a different kind of management, and to just productize it actually is to fall into the exact issues of the industrialized movement, which is we're going to centralize, commoditize, and standardize everything. And actually, a true living system, none of those things really apply. You can't standardize it, you can't centralize it, you sure as hell can't commoditize it. And if you try to do any of that using our industrialized approach, we end up extracting the health out of that system. And I think that's still an emerging idea. I mean, I think we're really early in the process of communicating that kind of message. What's been adopted by regenerative agriculture is that we could productize this. Hey, we've got a regenerative product. We've got something that says we did something that is rejuvenating or flourishing soil. And in reality, I think we've got a lot of work to do to be able to see it beyond that.
Because of your work, really working with entrepreneurs and also yourself, coming out of the business world where it can be siloed, very linear process, to take that living systems view. What did you either need to do or to become, or what do you see as this effective route for people that, I'm going to raise my hand here, just being very classically trained, neoliberal economics, business. What needs to happen to start to shift internally to have the fresh eyes?
Yeah. Well, I think at the core of this is recognizing that every living system isn't and can't be measured by productivity and efficiency. When you think about your human body and you want to live a high quality of life, you don't measure your productivity as a means to be able to determine if you're going to have a high quality of life. You measure your health. You say, hey, are all the things that make me healthy? And then out of that health, I do all these incredible things. I go and, bring new products into the world, or I engage in relationships and community, whatever it may be. What we say is that productivity and efficiency should be an outcome of a health of the system, not productivity and efficiency being the outcome that we find to be at the expense of the health of the system, which is what we've done as an industrialized society. Is we've focused all our indicators on how we produce more and how we do it as efficiently as possible. And when you have those as the two primary measures, you'll extract the hell out of everything because you're not tracking what anything else is, because those are the only two things that matter. And so we've got a classical economic system like that, neoclassical economic system like that. We've got our educational system like that. We have all our communities look more like that industrialized machine than they do as an ecosystem or a living system that has as a part of it emerging outcomes that we couldn't have expected, we couldn't have predicted. And that's the other thing. I said we've got such an addiction to prediction that we co-opt what is emerging as though we had knew it would happen in advance. And actually in reality, we didn't know. But we've all been there where we're like, oh yeah, that was part of my plan. All along, it was part of my plan. And in reality, it wasn't. And so to reinforce a behavior as well as a mindset that we can figure it out to such minute detail, I think creates a pattern that we can't live up to, which is why things get externalized. If we don't understand it, let's externalize it. Externalities exist because we couldn't fit it into the plan, right? And in a living system, there are no real boundaries the way that we would imagine them to be in a linear system. And so when they show up, we try to ignore them. We try to pass them off to somebody else. I had a conversation with a very large agricultural organization, one of the largest in the world. And their response was, we designed to ensure that our supply chain takes on all the things we don't want to manage. And then we force them to manage it so that we don't have to. Right. That is by definition that linear external, that system that is trying to force control into something so that they can then deliver on outcomes that are tied to shareholder value or influence stakeholder decisions that really isn't about the health of the system. It's just about what it produces within a very distinct time.
How do you rechart that? I mean, is it looking at all the externalities of an organization, of the impact? I mean, what is the methodology that you can begin to say, look, we want a wider dashboard. Our KPIs are not truly looking at the impacts that we're making within this community or on the planet.
Yeah, I think I think it is broadening it, but I think fundamentally it's seeing something through the lens of, I'll use an ecological term, the underlying ecosystem process, right? The thing I learned from Alan and from the Savory Institute and others over the years is if we're looking at the health of the system, we ask very different questions. And so I'll use this as an example. I've used it often in a lot of the things that I will talk about. I was walking the land once with Alan in Zimbabwe, and there was a species, an undesirable species that would be determined by most scientists, was starting to emerge in this landscape. And I remember Alan say, well, so what do you think about that? And I'm like, well, it's a species that, quote unquote, we don't want. And so the question becomes, how do we eradicate it? What does it look like to have less of that? And I remember my line of reasoning was about trying to control versus create different conditions. And that's what Alan said to me. And it was a life-changing moment for me. It was early in my time with Savory. So very early days, 2010, something like that. And I remember him saying, what do you think the conditions were for that species to emerge? Well, I was just like, wow, what a question. So the experiences that we have, what are the conditions that allow for that to emerge versus something else? And so then I started taking that and applying it to every single system that had a boundary to it. My personal life, why is that emerging? And what about teams? What about organizations? What about communities? Things are emerging. Why is that emerging versus something else? And what are the conditions that's creating that? And so then beginning that focus back into the underlying conditions, that, really shifts behaviors pretty substantially. And so you broaden what would traditionally be seen as paying attention to what are leading indicators. If we're thinking about traditional ways of monitoring linear systems versus lagging indicators, which are those things that are going to happen, but they already have happened. So you're looking backwards on them. And so, what are the indicators that you're paying attention to that actually create conditions for these results to emerge? And the other thing is, emergence isn't something we like. We don't like things to happen in a system that we can't explain nor predict. So we continue to try to force models or designs that minimize it. What happens if we maximize it? What happens if we actually put energy into the system that would allow for things to emerge that we wouldn't have expected as a part of this process? And so for me, that's really what it comes down to, is a part of that, is recognizing that emergence is a natural part of the system, and we should, as a part of that design, embrace it.
How do you go about creating an organization then, like nRhythm, where you're looking at these macro systems that have taken hundreds, maybe thousands of years to really build up to create that, and then saying, look, we're going to take a small organization, maybe even a startup, and we think that that's going to potentially change the course of the system. Like how do you begin to even conceive of an organization that can be effective in that space?
Yeah, we see it in a fractal way. So I think there are kind of, we would call this three lines of work. I took that out of some of Carol Sanford's work, where we recognize you got to work all aspects of that system to be able to create the conditions that we want, which is, what does that look for the individual in its own development in that? What does it look like for the organization or the system of which you are in relationship to? And then what's that larger, more robust system that you're a part of? And so when we think about it at an organizational level, we go, hey, the individuals, what does agency look like and will, and how do we create conditions for their own development to be able to be decision makers in ways that enhance their well-being, their quality of life, and is a additive to the quality of life of this collective organization. And we really encourage that kind of design that's at the individual level and the organizational level to be able to impact and influence this. We all recognize that because of our current designs and our economies, that we're working on a timetable that is incredibly limited. So there are only so many things we can do within that limited time frame, and we continue to encourage alignment with individuals, organizations, investors, customers, the entire ecosystem of an organization, to lengthen that timetable. And and everybody's going to be comfortable with different ranges of what that is. Some people, as we see in the public markets, can't get more comfortable than a quarter, right? Others may get comfortable with a year, right? Some are getting comfortable with 3 to 5 years. And then some are, even like some indigenous cultures for millennia, have been thinking about generational design. And what does that look like when we're thinking 70 years or 100 plus years of design? And I just don't think we've done enough of that to even say exactly what does all that look like. We've just, over the last 100 plus years, are not even asking those questions, which I don't think allows us to be in rhythm with life, to see what would emerge as a opportunity to partner in that way.
What are the kind of organizations that you specialize working with, and what is it by sector specific or age of organization? Can you give some examples of what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah, this probably goes to the heart of our work. When I came out of Savory, really wanting to broaden this beyond agriculture, I said to myself, what does it look like for a tech company, a manufacturing company, a healthcare company, an architectural firm, an educational institution, a government entity, or a community organization, all to embrace an approach that puts life at the center? So we don't put limitations on that. What we say is where there's will and a desire to design with those conditions, you can see that in a entrepreneurial organization that gets to start, in essence, blank slate, to community organizations that are having to collaborate across multiple different silos or industries. And we pride ourselves on trying to bring an approach that crosses industry as a means to inform society and its design. So it's really important to us to find ourselves committed to what voices need to be in the room that allow us to get out of those silos. So we don't focus on an industry, though I can say, because of my background and some of the other team members' backgrounds, still 40 to 50% of the work we do is in the ag sector, the food and ag sector. And I hope it continues to be a large portion of what we do, because I think as we continue to support the health of this planet, we hope that that will rejuvenate or regenerate all of the healthy conditions that we need for future generations. But we're excited about this approach in all these other sectors. I mean, we often use this tagline of with life at the center. But what does agriculture with life look like? What does healthcare, what does education with life look like? What does society, communities, municipalities, government with life look like? And I think we have designed life out of it all unintentionally. I don't think anybody would say, well, we don't want life in our systems. But our designs are designed to be machines with specific outcomes. And those specific outcomes are not at all the conditions that create more life. They usually shut life down. And that's what we've seen that industrialized ag has done, right? We're seeing less and less life in the soil, less and less nutrients in our food, less and less life in the living, beings of animals and crops and plants. All of that is getting less and less because we're killing the very soil that all of this is based in. So for us, if we can just recognize that industrialized silos were designed to increase productivity and efficiency. They were not designed that way for health. So if health is at the center or life is at the center of the design, I don't think we would have industry. I think industry would disappear. I mean, there are insights that we have, but those insights, I think, get in the way of us seeing more life and more potential in the system. And there's several great articles and books, like Voltaire's Bastards, that talks about our specialization as a means to our reducing the potential or the real life in the system. And I feel like really at the heart of nRhythm is to break down those silos, to bring people into a conversation and recognize that at the heart of all of that is this with life approach that brings more, not less.
I love that framing of just holding what would this look like with life at the center, and that really brings me to the name of our podcast is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, and realizing that approach towards creating habitat does not have life at the center, and from working on like very small projects up to very large institutional projects, you quickly get to the understanding that finance is at the center of this industry, and finance is not holding that question of what does life look like or have life at the center. And I this has been a theme over the past, let's call it almost a year now, to really focus on the capital side of things of this industry. We've done a lot with design and materiality and understanding community and patterns. But really that the next horizon for us has been, how do we really start to understand finance and the capital stack? I see you've created a partnership with the Capital Institute, where we've got a lot of respect for what John Fullerton has created there. Tell me about that foray into that relationship, into that sector that, finance is kind of like the umbrella that overarches all other industries as well. What's been your takeaway working with that organization?
Yeah. So I've had the pleasure of being in a relationship with John now for 15 years. And so he was influenced by Alan at the Savory Institute, just like I was. And he took it into economics and a lot of other influences into that design, just like in ours. But what we were both really deeply committed to is what does and is a holistic approach to how we do life together and do work together, right? And that economic system creates conditions that we at times are just unaware of. And our current economic system creates all kinds of conditions that enslave us. They do not free us up. They force and confine us. And so we are about reimagining what that is. If you're looking at it through the lens and the patterns of living systems, the way we've designed our neoclassical approach is benefiting only a few. And yes, there has been some large swaths of people, but there's also been those who have not benefited from these designs. And so, what does it look like for us to embrace the potential or a mindset of curiosity that allows us to say, what if the design was different? And what if money was more a tool than something we are supposed to maintain as an indicator of our success, right? How do we put money as a tool to work to enhance the quality of life of ourselves and the communities that we're a part of? I mean, really, that's what all of that was meant to be for. And I don't think the way that it has concentrated itself, the way that some have received the benefit of the use of those funds and others have not, has created an inequity that I think can change and still allow for freedom and all kinds of opportunities to be an entrepreneur, but also recognize that there are things that we're going to choose to do if we put life at the center of that design. And to your point, with the economic system being at the center of a lot of design, right? Accumulation becomes the indicator. And I just don't think accumulation is an indicator that will do anything but increase accumulation versus redistribute and create conditions for more wealth and opportunity across country and communities.
Before we continue this episode, I want to talk about the tremendous potential embedded within the real estate industry to create life-giving communities and thriving habitats. The hard part, though, is that development is complex and requires specialized knowledge around design, planning, capital and investment, community engagement, and construction. That's why at Latitude Regenerative Real Estate, our work goes to serve those that seek to create projects that strengthen communities and develop ecological resilience. We work with developers and landowners to bring purpose-driven projects to life. So when you are ready to leave a legacy and need an experienced team that knows how to create successful projects, I encourage you to reach out to us by visiting our website at chooselatitude.com. One of the things that's come up for me recently that it's really percolating up because of this conversation is I've got different peer groups and friends that, the whole design of their professional life is around creating fund structures and finding the vehicle that's going to maximize that return. And so we end up with, right now, lots of self-storage. The new thing is this like industrial outdoor storage park. It's just like, this is a way that you can get IRR, and it's veiled in this, we're here to help everyday folks, create a retirement plan. And it's such a fun, like, once you start to realize how big that industry is, and what we're talking about is so minuscule of taking this more patterned approach and holistic approach, it becomes so gloomy for me to realize that you've got trillions of dollars flowing towards something that is life-taking. And where I'm going with this is, how do you stay resourced working up against these tremendous systems that are so extractive? What does it require for you to really stay on that path and not to fall into this, oh, I need some of that as well. I
Sure.
think a lot of entrepreneurs, we have to grapple with that if we need to keep the roof over our head and food on the plate. So what does it really take to do systems work, a regenerative work in an economic system, or the mainstream paradigm that is so contra to this?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I'll address that both from a personally, how has that showed up for me in this process, but principally, one of the things that John says in his principles of regenerative vitality is everything's in right relationship. And unfortunately, we have this kind of investor slash, entrepreneur slash operator relationship that really is at its core transactional. There isn't a lot of room for resilience. And partly because for the reasons you just shared, if I'm going to guarantee an IRR, then that means I'm going to have to hold everybody accountable and really squeeze everything out of it. Because if I'm maximizing something, right, that means I'm going to minimize something. You can't maximize without minimize. And that is the essence of the principle: maximize productivity, minimize inefficiency, right? And when we think about a healthy system, there is no max min. That mentality or binary approach isn't even a part of the design. It's everything in symbiotic relationships that are meant to be working with one another. So somebody or something to force a design to then extract and then take that extraction and go someplace else with it, that just doesn't make sense, because it would all be reincorporated back into that system. So our approach is about building those deep long-term relationships that isn't going to be looking at things transactionally, but across a longer time frame, with all of these things that we're talking about in mind. So aligned context. And so we talk about foundational beliefs as being the essence of how we aligned around why we do what we do, and how do we ensure that when we bring others, partners into that relationship, that is a part of the process of both onboarding and working into that. To know that the majority of money out there would not be accessible, both by choice or by opportunity, because it just wouldn't align. And how do we then continue to create conditions for more capital to be aligned with life? And I think the Capital Institute is a perfect example of influencing a whole industry to reimagine what that is as a part of that process, versus current design is really about those returns, so that we can then talk about that fund that we've created to provide those returns. And in reality, we've got really lucky. I mean, there's just so much to all of that. And the control and constraints that need to be to that extent are actually very, very difficult to do. And so that means you're going to be very restrictive versus opening things up again to creating better conditions. One of the things that we know as a part of the current system is that we talk about shifting from accountability to responsibility. We're not building development within the system. What we're doing is forcing control to guarantee outcomes. We talk about what does it look like to create conditions for people to be more responsible, because with that becomes agency, with that comes better decision making. And there, I think we get long term resilience and abundance versus short term limited scope and accountable and controlled to guarantee particular financial outcomes. And those are the kind of things that we're constantly thinking about. And that means capital has to be more patient and it has to be working in a relationship. And the other thing, I'll say one more thing and then let you ask more questions or riff off that, is we think about ecosystem design and not just individual organizational design. Because I think up and downstream an ecosystem, right, like a watershed, you would think about that's all interrelated. So for you to be able to invest in a particular organization, but not think about the environment that's a part of and what needs to be invested in that ecosystem as a part of that design, I think is actually not even recognizing how those different nested systems work. And I think the more ecosystem design that comes forward, I think puts a whole bunch of businesses, organizations, communities in a better footing to be resilient and healthy, because now we're thinking about supporting that whole ecosystem and not just one-off organizations.
I want to continue down this rabbit hole, and I want to continue to tailor it towards real estate now, because I'm curious, if you were asked the question, what does real estate look like with life at the center? How would you answer that?
It's great. One of the firms that we're in deep partnership with is an architectural firm in Seattle. So the idea that the built environment, real estate, how we actually put both land and buildings together in a design that actually can create more life, I think is core, because we are great at making things and we are great at establishing things. So what does it look like for those things that we make and establish to be aligned with those natural living systems? And so I think it's a phenomenal question and one that we need to ask more and more of ourselves, because we can make lots of decisions that around real estate or the built environment that would extract for all kinds of reasons, where it's just seen in a silo. It's seen, both transactional boundary and what we could provide a return on. And I think that's created all kinds of unintended consequences. And we can see that from state to state in the United States, see it in other communities. Well, I mean, it's kind of crazy. And I'm sure you wrestle through the reality of knowing I was having a conversation with my dad back in the 1960s when he bought the house that I grew up in, and he paid roughly $24,000 for it. And that same property in LA was the same price during that time. Two designed single family dwelling, ranch style home, both about the same price. The one where I grew up in East Dallas didn't really increase in value compared to what happened in LA. And to understand that realities of those kinds of dynamics in a system where really behavior influenced that, and what about that would change if life was at the center of it? Whatever the whims of a transaction or real estate market would create outcomes. And I just think it would be a phenomenal case study in us playing with conditions to see, would the design be different? I beg that it would substantially if we ask those questions. And actually, I'm not a real estate guy. You would know 10 times more than I would know. And that's why we would need all the real estate people in the room, as well as the economists in the room, as well as the agriculturalists in the room, as well as others that could give us insight into what would it look like if that shifted or changed or that design was different. To know that my dad's house that he bought back then now is worth $100,000 in East Dallas, and it's worth $500,000 or $1 million in LA, just gives you what about that design does not work. And I understand what wealth it's created in communities all over, but we've got an actual generational problem now. My sons will not be able to make enough money to be able to buy a home like that. It will be almost impossible. So we've allowed a design to create unintentional consequences for future generations that we continue to just kick the can down the line because nobody wants to address it. It's a issue of the system, and one that I think we have to talk about. It's not a moral issue. It's we made a design decision and we embraced it. And this is the result of that. And how can we make a new design decision and see what would emerge if we were serious about a new design?
I think the operative thing that I pick up there is getting people into relationship to answer that question, to start to ideate and generate different ideas. Was that's another thing that I really have to, I grapple with a lot of this from the traditional approach, which is I can go out and buy a piece of land, and me as a developer, I can create what I think I want to there, as long as it's within the boundaries of finance and zoning. It's on the table. To now really starting to ask that question of what does this community want to create, and who are the right stakeholders that we need to bring to the table, and realizing there's a lot of mindfulness and intention that needs to go into that. There's not necessarily a right answer. There's certainly a wrong answer there at times, but I think that's been my biggest takeaway over the last 5 years of really trying to work within the vein of regenerative real estate to say, how do we take this approach, ask these questions, and realize that one of our guests and mentors, a guy named Aaron Fairchild, so beautifully coined this sitting in the arc of hypocrisy. And with your example from your dad of having this house that is appreciated massively in a city like Los Angeles, I was talking with these young aspiring farmers the other day, and one of them was just saying, I'm never going to be able to buy a house, much less a farm. And she was quite exasperated. And I was really trying to advocate for you need to figure out a way to do that, though. I know that you feel like the deck is stacked against you, but if you're feeling that now, you're really going to feel that 30 years from now. Whenever you don't own that parcel, and all of a sudden the 2024 price that was, a couple $100,000 is now several $1 million. So I don't know if that is embracing a pessimistic look that we're not going to change the system by then, or if it's trying to embrace the realist side of, this is what we're working in right now, and we've got to bend some rule. We can do some really creative stuff to help kind of get you there. But my big takeaway is ask those questions and really sit in it. Because for me, a lot of it is discomfort, and of realizing that I'm kind of an all or nothing kind of person. I don't naturally gravitate towards the middle or the gray, but that's where we live right now.
Yeah. And I mean, Neal, I think all of what you're saying is the reality of what we're in. So I think it's going to require a lot of us to what's a little more life look like versus the ideal design of all of it. I mean, I feel like we could make some incremental progress while we're continuing to figure out a design that would be a massive improvement to the current system. But that's going to require multiple other individuals, organizations, policymakers to shift that design. But I think we can make progress with what we have. I just feel like if we just started asking the question, if we did this real estate investment with life at the center of it, how would we do this? Versus when it's not a part of the conversations, do the things we see. Gosh, how fast can I flip this? What would be my IRR on that? And how do I look at the best way to make this appreciate at the fastest rate? What does my investment in and my investment out look like? It's all financial related. And those are still important questions you can ask yourself, but some of those things are going to extract the hell out of it. And some of those things may not. And I just feel like expanding it to ask that question while we're continuing to figure it out, I think is important. I mean, somebody brought a potential real estate play into a conversation about what we were doing in Northeast Texas. And the question was, well, what do you think about that? I said, well, all that's been talked about is the financial pieces of it. We could never make a decision just on that. And tell me how many people make decisions just on that. Those are the things that we're trying to shift behavior wise to be able to recognize that it's more and needs to be more holistic and encompassing, and that we can do some things that will enhance life. And we can also do some things that will suck the life out of it.
Yeah, that this is the unfortunate part, is that we're very purpose driven with the kinds of real estate projects that we get involved. Oftentimes it includes affordability or land conservation. We really try to re-examine the question of what is the highest and best use. And so a lot of this work is inviting people into a new possibility. But whenever it gets boiled down into, you need to go raise capital, you need to attract people to this team, especially if you're going to go talk to bankers, you have to eliminate your entire vision section of that deck because they can't speak that language. And it creates such an interesting juxtaposition of we're crafting this vision and inviting people into it. And so it's gathering life force that way. But this other half of it that you need, that's equally as important, it's like they don't want the vision. This is the public service announcement that I'm getting out of this is like, it's okay to still ask these questions of what is the highest and best use, but let's equally ask, what does this look like with life at the center of it?
Yeah.
And I love
That's
that.
spot on. And that's what, when I'm asking people practically, or we're having conversations about what's my next practical, and they said, just ask that question. Just ask that question. What does the design look like with life at the center? And I won't even tell you what I think that is. You have to struggle through what that is. And I think the more people ask that question, I think they will design differently. And we definitely need financiers, the banking institutions, all aligning around what does it look like to make capital available with life at the center. I mean, I do think there will be blended dollars, both philanthropic and investment dollars, that will allow for bridging a lot of those things. And that's what we'll have to continue to encourage. It cannot just be based on a single metric or the metrics that we've been using. And I get that that's the way it is. And so this is an alternative, and while we continue to work the existing system.
If we zoom out of real estate a little bit, just towards those examples that you might really like to pull from, is there an organization or a company that you like to say, wow, that was an incredible experience, that they really went through this process of transformation? Do you have any that could kind of ground the philosophical nature of this?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of micro examples. I think at the largest scale, there's less and less of those. But from an ecosystem perspective, I'm going to use, which you may be familiar with, a company called Mondragon. And Mondragon was in Spain, and it's one of the largest cooperatives in the world. But they would have used this language years and years ago. It's, I think their collective revenue across all of the organizations in their ecosystem is several billions of dollars of annual turnover. And the thing I'm most inspired about them, both what we would traditionally say, where's the scale in this, is that they have used this as a design to create an ecosystem of real resilience, where things are seen as a way to support others as a part of the ecosystem. And that's why ecosystem language for me is so important. We have been like islands. No wonder it takes why most organizations or entrepreneurs fail, because they're out there alone and trying to do it alone. And actually, most people can't and won't figure it out because it's just tough. It's tough to build a business like that. On top of the design isn't for them to succeed. those larger institutional players are there to extract what they discovered or what they figured out and put it to work at the scale that they're already at. So, the Mondragons of the world creating ecosystems of organizations that truly are in relationship with one another to bring more life into the system that benefits the individuals as a part of that system and the system itself that's being created, to me is so inspiring to see it through that kind of lens. And they've got case study after case study after case study of how that design has really served Mondragon and other organizations like that. And well, on top of the ecosystem design, I think there are a lot of organizations that have come out of like the B Corp movement, where they really are at the center of what they're trying to do more than just provide a financial return. What's the benefit to society as a part of that design? And you can see some in the food and ag space. You can see some in the fiber space. Organizations like Patagonia that have really tried to put a very different why at the center of their decision making. And then I just feel like we have lots of community based organizations around the world and in the United States that do that at scales that are meaningful to them, their families, those teams, and the communities that they're a part of. Where, it may be an organization that's doing 5 or 10 million in sales, and that is meaningful to those families and in ways that can transform those communities. And I think we need more and more small businesses like that than we need big, giant multinational organizations where there's too much power and too much centralized control.
Amen. Tre, let me end with this question around your endeavor called With Life. Who is this program for? What do you hope to get out of it and the legacy that you wanted to leave? Can you tell us a little bit more so we can orient folks that may be interested in taking their organization towards this direction of they can feel that there's something there, that there's more potential. They might want to make a bigger impact. Is this the right program for them to interface with nRhythm, or is there something, a different direction that you would recommend?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. Part of the With Life nomenclature came from really trying to help explain what regeneration is. And you having been a part of this for a while, me having been a part of it for a while as well, recognize that even recently with the idea of regeneration coming into more and more of the food and ag space, there's still more questions about what does that mean than there is questions about, so both what it is or what it is not. And we just felt, how do we simplify that message? What do we mean when we talk about it's regenerative, right? And we just said that means it's teaming with life. That's really what we're saying. And so we just said, well, why don't we just build an entire movement around this with life intention, and that we apply it across all kinds of departments in an organization, all kinds of industries in a society, all kinds of communities in a state or in a nation, right? Where that if we were designing with life in mind as the tag, it would change all our designs. So with life just becomes an easy way for me and you to have a conversation to say, what does your family look like with life? What does the individual look like with life? What does it look like to embrace my community with more life? And I just think our behaviors change, how we put money to work changes. And I believe the way you would design, manage, and monitor an organization would all change. And I feel like our current management approaches are not with life in mind, it's with productivity and efficiency in mind. And we know what the outcomes are of that. It's usually at the expense of things. Sometimes it's the expense of the planet. Sometimes it's the expense of people. in reality, I think we've got to seek out a better design. And that's why we say, let's do it with life in mind. And so I admonish and encourage anybody to participate in the programming. We're committed to building more and more capacity in all our systems for people to design, to manage, and to monitor the conditions for life in all of our systems. And we believe if we all collectively start doing that, just by asking those questions, I think we'll all have a different quality of life.
Love it. Let's point people in that direction then. Where is there a website or any kind of resource that people can learn more about?
So anybody can join the withlife.community for free, and lots of free resources. Join the With Life community, a lot of different things you can participate in, a couple of mini courses, and we'll just continue to pour more and more resources in there for people. Right now, the community is about a couple of thousand people, so it's growing, which is great. And then you also can sign up for our newsletter, things that go out regularly that you can find on the website, nrhythm.co. But the With Life community is probably the best place for you to just sign up, join, and be a part of a growing community of people that's saying, listen, this life thing really is important, and we're going to design with her in mind.
I love it. I'm going to have to sign up myself. Tre, it is a pleasure to have you on here. Thank you for coming on, as well as just being a great inspiration and a leader within the regenerative movement. It's truly remarkable to see the people that are, it's not just a buzzword for, that they're actually really embracing this approach. And you're right up at that list of real catalysts that are making it happen. So it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Neal. Absolutely pleasure being here.
Okay, that is a wrap. Thank you for tuning in to the show today. If you got any value out of this conversation, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss future episodes. I can honestly say that these conversations have changed my life, my business, and how I steward my own home. If you want to learn more about our work at Latitude, where we partner with property owners, developers, and stewards to create thriving communities and resilient habitats, then you can find us online at chooselatitude.com. Also, if you have a project that you are needing help bringing to life or would like to align your investment portfolio with profitable investment opportunities that benefit communities and the environment, then you can reach out to me directly at neal@chooselatitude.com, and we can start a conversation from there. Okay, that's it. Until next time, here's a friendly reminder that the water we drink falls from the heavens. The air we breathe comes from the beautiful symbiotic relationship we have with plants. The food that nourishes our bodies come from the ground we so cavalierly pave over, and that we all have a role to play to regenerate this planet.